What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. Glad that you're with us today. This program is for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Hey, if that is you, if you are anything from Baptist to Buddhist, anything in between, maybe you're a person of no faith at all, but you've got some questions about the Catholic faith. We can answer those questions, and we're glad to do so on today's program. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. If you're watching us on TV today, you can participate as well. Our email address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Those of you who enjoy texting, you can text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. Pedro Aquila is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Rich Jesse handles social media for us. If you'd like to ask a question via YouTube, we are streaming there live right now. Just put your question in the comments box if you would. Rich will see that. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio, and love to get your question answered on today's program. Again, the phone number 833-288-EWTN. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I am very well. How are you, sir?
I'm doing decent. Thanks so much.
I'm going to pass on this interesting question here. This is from an anonymous listener, viewer. For more than 500 years, Catholics have been telling Protestants and humanity that their salvation depends on being part of the church. But after Vatican II, it's been said that there is an invisible church to which everybody seems to be a part of. Isn't this a clear rupture with historic Catholicism? Isn't this church without visible borders very similar to what Protestants believe? And can religions and practices condemned in the past be now passed to salvation?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So first of all, I've read a lot of Catholic ecclesiology over the years and a lot of Catholic theology, and I have yet to find the Catholic defending the concept of an invisible church, right? That is not a Catholic concept. The Catholic Church teaches that there's a very visible church with which one may be in varying degrees of communion, some more explicit, some more implicit. Okay. Now, let me give you a little background on the Protestant doctrine of the invisible church. So it's changed over the centuries. It's not the same today as it used to be. The idea of the invisible church within Protestantism first arose in the 16th century as a polemical response to the Catholic charge that Protestants had left the church. And what the Protestant church answered, what reformers like Luther and Calvin said, was this. They said, well, no, we believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church, which we believe is normatively visible. They believed in hierarchy and sacraments and that kind of thing. But, so said the Protestants, the form of the church has become deformed, that it's been kind of awash in superstition and human traditions. And so you have the faith in baptism kind of smoldering underneath a pile of ashes, as it were. And our job as the reformers is to come by and blow away the smoke and let that pristine purity be visible again. So that was the idea. They believed in a historic continuity, of a church that was held together by sacraments and authority with succession back to the apostles. They explicitly talk about apostolic succession, but a succession of doctrine, not of ordination. But they thought that had been obscured by papal superstition and human traditions, and they were just going to clear that away. So that's the way the doctrine was initially articulated. It wasn't the concept of a kind of free-floating Platonic unity out there in space. It was an historic apostolic church that had historical continuity, but that had just become buried. Now, what happened within Protestantism was the principle of sola scriptura failed to create the kind of ecclesial unity that they had hoped for, because every Protestant group had a different interpretation of the Bible. And so while they maintained an expectation of one holy Catholic and apostolic church, they could never realize that in practice. And so by the time you get to the 18th century, you find a new ecclesiology emerge within Protestantism. I see it clearly in the work of George Whitefield, for example, the evangelist, who says, well, sacraments and authority, things of that sort, we'll never agree on those things, so they fundamentally don't matter.
Wow.
And that was an innovation. That was a change. The early Protestants wouldn't have taken that position, because these things are non-essentials. What really matters is this spiritual rebirth in the heart that we call being born again. And as long as you have that, you belong to the only church that you really need to belong to. And so now it's an ecclesial unity based on an inward spiritual experience that's not visible, right?
Okay.
That's different. That's a new thing that emerges in 18th century Protestantism that now is standard fare. So if you ask a Protestant today, what is the invisible church? He'll say something like, well, it's the union that all true believers have, because they're united by faith in Jesus in their hearts. And there's no essential visible referent to that, okay? So neither one of those is the Catholic position at all.
Okay.
Catholic Church teaches that there is a determinate visible association called the Catholic Church that Jesus founded, and that you must be in union with that church to be saved. However, your union can be explicit through formal baptism and reception of the sacraments, or it could be implicit by some kind of desire. And so the idea that there is a baptism of desire has always been part of the Catholic system, allowing someone like St. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century to say that even Socrates was a Christian, though he didn't know it, because he was led by the same divine Logos that has become incarnate for us in Jesus. And you find characters throughout Catholic history that maintain that you do not have to be a visible card-carrying member of the Catholic Church in order to be saved. St. Thomas, of course, writes extensively about the sanctity and the salvation of, say, the Old Testament saints. You can even find somebody like Bishop John Carroll, a 18th and early 19th century American Catholic prelate, who says you have to distinguish between being a member of the church and being in communion with the church. And members, as he understands it, they're baptized and confirmed and communing members. They're in communion, but members are just someone who has at least an implicit desire for baptism. And so those distinctions are made more explicit, of course, by the Second Vatican Council, but it's not a complete innovation the way you suggest.
Very good. Thanks so much for your anonymous question there. If you would like to send us an email for a future show, here's the address. Also very handy for those of you watching on TV today. ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. In a moment, we're going to be talking with Joseph in Germantown, Maryland. We've got other calls coming in right now, and you can add to it because we do have a few open lines here, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. It's called A Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Do stay with us. It's called A Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for us, 833-288-3986. We're going to get to the phones in just a second here. For over 40 years now, EWTN has been praying with and for people throughout the world. That's why we're known as the Global Catholic Network. Well, today, we want to pray for anything that weighs on your heart, such as family members, health, finances. It is our honor to pray for you, and we take it very seriously. Please take a moment right now. Send us your prayer request. Here's the address, EWTN.com/prayer. EWTN.com/prayer. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning today with Joseph in Germantown, Maryland, listening on the Great Guadalupe Radio. Hello, Joseph. What's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, I was wondering if Dr. David Anders could please explain the argument that I've heard recently about the seamless garment in terms of, what's going to be coming up soon in terms of our voting.
Sure. Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me say at the outset that one thing I am not going to do is tell people how to vote. Or take a political stance, or even make a policy pronouncement.
Good.
Okay, I'm not going to do that. So nothing that I say should be construed as any endorsement of any particular party or policy or anything of the sort. But I will try to explain Catholic moral teaching. So the Catholic moral teaching is unlike some Protestant churches, not based on a divine command theory of ethics. In other words, there are some churches that say, well, the way you know right and wrong is God has laid out a series of commands, and you do what God says to do, and you avoid what God says not to do, and voila, that's the sum total of Christian moral teaching. And that's not the Catholic position, never has been. Catholic position is that to the extent that we find commands in sacred Scripture that speak to our moral duties and obligations, they are there and they're normative because they reflect intrinsic truths about human nature. And so the moral law is something that's not just written on stone, as it were. It's something that's written into the fabric of our very nature as human beings. And so just like there is a good, say, for tree frogs, and presumably it's not to play in busy highways or bowling alleys, right? There is a good for the human person, and it is as objective as facts about his biology. And in fact, facts about his biology are part of the truth of the human person that has to be taken into consideration. And so, you might put it this way. I mean, if you're a parent, as I am, or a grandparent, and you have a care for your family, and you need to take care of your health to make sure you can provide for them, it would be irresponsible to engage in behaviors that endanger your health. I mean, today, my own opinion would be like, maybe 100 years ago, 50 years ago, it wouldn't have been the case, but it'd be very irresponsible for me to take up the habit of smoking, right?
Yeah.
Given that I know that it's likely to cause cancer and, could lead to my death, and my family needs me, so that'd be an irresponsible. It wouldn't be moral of me to make that choice in my own case. Now, I'm not saying people who smoke are bad, because some people started when they were teenagers and they can't quit, they kick the habit. That's different. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about taking up the habit when I'm 54 years old and I know better, right? And you could extrapolate to other kinds of situations. There is a good for the human person, and I'm morally obligated to seek it. And so in that sense, all of Catholic moral theology is really a kind of rational quest to seek happiness. And you can find this in St. Augustine. You can find it in St. Thomas. He says that there is an end for the human person, and it is happiness, right? But happiness broadly conceived. It's a happiness that takes into consideration not only our biological wants and needs, but our spiritual nature, because we're an organic unity of body and spirit. So things like to know the truth about God and my ultimate destiny. These are also part of the human quest for happiness. And because my spiritual nature is not somehow alien to my body, they all integrate into a unit. So my spiritual good and my bodily good can't be at radical cross purposes to one another. And thus, as Catholics, when you seek the good of your neighbor, you are seeking what the Catholic Church calls his integral good. You're seeking the good of a body-soul social unity. You're seeking the good of a being who lives in society, who lives within a biological realm, who also has a spiritual nature, who has an intellectual nature, who has an emotional nature. And you're seeking the flourishing of the individual at all of those levels in an integrated fashion, right? And that's Catholic moral theology. Now, where the seamless garment business comes in, there's a good way of taking that doctrine and there's a bad way of taking it. The good way is to say, something like, should I take up the habit of smoking? And is it okay to murder my neighbor? Those are not arbitrarily disconnected things. Like, they both ultimately come back to one common core, which is the dignity of the human person and our universal call to holiness and to the truth about God and ourselves. Both of them flow from a common source. And so there is a sense in which there's a sort of seamless garment in the Catholic's moral teaching, insofar as it all flows from this one sort of rational center. And that's a fine way to take the doctrine. Now, it has been put to a different use. And that is to say, when Catholics, say in the political sphere, highlight what seem to be really, really central truths in the hierarchy of moral values, say something like the dignity of human life, the right to life, right? That you cannot kill people, right? Whether those people be unborn or the aged, you just cannot wantonly kill people. That's a really fundamental moral truth. And hierarchically, it would rank above something like, let's not go speeding on the interstate, right? No, they're both true.
Yes.
But one is more central to our understanding of the moral life than another.
Sure.
The seamless garment doctrine has been employed by some polemical actors to try to lessen the force of, say, the pro-life cause. Right, when traditional Catholics get out in the public sphere and talk loudly about the church's ethic on life, in particular its opposition to abortion, or maybe so its defense of marriage. It has sometimes happened that someone comes along and says, well, hey, you know, it also says you have to pay a living wage. And so, don't muddy the waters with all this abortion talk, because we need to get, down to brass tacks about raising the minimum wage. And that's, if I do that, I'm consistently pro-life, and you're just muddying the waters over there, you pro-life people, right? That, I'm making a caricature of it, but that's the idea,
Okay.
And so when it's employed polemically to try to sunder Catholic moral teaching, that's the charge that it makes against some actors, though I think it's guilty of the same thing from a different sort of political angle.
All right. Is that helpful for you, Joseph?
Yes, thank you.
Thank
you are most welcome. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Let's go now to Rick in Minnesota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Hello, Rick. What's on your mind today, sir?
I've heard you say that the title of Mary as spouse of the Holy Spirit is metaphorical, and I've heard you say that it's not as if Mary had sex with God. Begs this question, which I don't think is a dilemma that you can jump through the horns of. Was the conception of Jesus of Nazareth sexual or asexual?
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the question. Well, it was clearly virginal. His conception was virginal.
Yes.
Of that, Scripture and tradition are extremely clear. Now, if you want to know what happened at the chromosomal level, that's a level of refinement that I don't think sacred tradition addresses. How did the miracle occur? Well, if I could answer that, it wouldn't be a miracle now, would it?
Yeah.
Right? I don't know how the miracle occurred. I do know that Jesus is a complete human being with a full set of chromosomes, that his humanity is complete. He lacks nothing that is essential to humanity. How that takes place with a virginal conception, I have no idea.
Okay. That's where we have to leave it. Rick, thanks so much for your call today. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Two lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or perhaps you might like to tell us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. Well, 833-288-EWTN. Here's Andrew now, a first-time caller from Los Angeles, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Andrew, what's on your mind today, sir?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go right ahead, Andrew.
Just my quick question was that the early church, I've got relatives who are Greek Orthodox, and a lot of us are probably Roman Catholic. The church that Christ handed down to Peter and the disciples and the first early century church, the word Catholic obviously is universal. So we're all one Christian, one church at the early days, up to before 1054, whatever the schism. But how did it evolve? What was the fork in the road that I understand history in terms of who wanted to be in the Pope, and Peter and Paul died in Rome and stuff. But why was there a Byzantine influence from Byzantine Constantine, post-Constantine, that caused the Catholic to go left and the Greek go right, in addition to the schism, if there were one Catholic, one body at the time throughout the entire early church?
Yeah, thanks. I understand the question, although I might take issue with the left and right characterization if that's meant to indicate any kind of ideological split, right? But because both traditions would consider themselves to be right in the sense of conservative, i.e. conserving sacred tradition. So the division between the eastern part of the Catholic faith and the western part is old, and it's very difficult to put a singular date on it and say this is the moment when things split apart. I mean, even as early as the 4th century, you can find this attitude. Well, Rome used to be the center of the empire, and that was where all the action was, but Constantinople is the center of the empire now, and this is where the action is, and so things ought to shift. I mean, you can find that even at the Council of Constantinople in 381, there were council fathers that floated the idea, well, now that Constantinople is the seat of the empire, maybe it should be the seat of the church. Now, the amazing thing about that is they floated the idea and it sank without a trace, right? The Council of Constantinople did not agree. They were not amused, right? and in the 5th century, in 451, at the Council of Chalcedon, when Pope Leo, very much a Latin pope, promulgated his tome on Christology, the council hailed the document as Peter speaking through Leo. So that was the orthodox position on the role of the pope. But nevertheless, there were forces that were let us say, tending away from Catholic unity early on based on political considerations and geography and things of that sort. You know, it was a practical matter after the fall of the empire. The communication in the West and the life of letters and so forth did sort of fall into disarray. The Western world lost a level of cultural development after the fall of the empire that it didn't regain until the 18th century. I mean, so it was a real devastating event economically to the West. And you know, there's an image of the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, who from the Eastern Empire's point of view was you know, he was some redneck rumblebuffin from from nowhere, this pretender. And when he had himself crowned emperor of the Romans, they were not amused. They were not amused at all. But Charlemagne, you know, aspired to create this glorious court, and he brought in Alcuin to improve the state of letters and education and all the intellectuals that he could lay his hands on. He himself never learned effectively how to read and write. Right.
Wow.
And he tried, you know, but you can sort of see him sitting there, you know, leaning over a candle flame at night with Alcuin at his shoulder, and Charlemagne dropping great big beads of sweat, you know, while he's trying to figure out how to make out his letters while holding his crayon with his fist the wrong way, you know.
Boy.
And that was very much the image that the East had of the West, you know, and they didn't have a lot of respect. And so by the 9th century, which is the same century in which Charlemagne ascends to power, you have the Phocian schism, which is Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, is kicking around for reasons to withhold obedience to the Pope and to the West. And when one reads it, one gets the impression that Photius is like, well, what can I throw at the wall to see what sticks? You know, let's try a bunch of arguments. Well, you know, the Latin Church uses unleavened bread. Well, Latin priests shave. Oh, yeah, and there's the filioque thing, too. We don't like that. And that was the one that really took off, of course. Mm-hmm. But Photius, of course, is reconciled within his own lifetime to the Church, and so that didn't really fully take. And then, of course, there's the mutual excommunications in 1054. That didn't help the situation. But it really wasn't a definitive split between East and West. You know, a date that is often traditionally thrown out there is the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople in 1204, 1205. And I think it's pretty clear, probably by the early 13th century, things had really come to an impasse and they weren't going to be fixed. But the division, I mean, it's been warranted theologically, but it really begins culturally centuries before then. And you know, and it's like those second cousins that you know you're related to that you never talk to, you know, and then you might actually find that you have to get together at a family gathering sometime and you have nothing to say to one another, you know. I mean, that's the sense one has. I mean, yes, the theologians get to work and they sharpen their polemical knives and hurl darts at each other, but this is it's deeper than just theology. There's a cultural, linguistic difference. Hurt feelings and prejudice on both sides that go back for centuries.
But we got to pray for unity.
That's right.
Absolutely. Andrew, thank you so much for your call today. Appreciate hearing from you in Los Angeles. In a moment, we're going to get to Rafael in Jacksonville, Florida. Also, Chris calling in from Southern California. A couple lines open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Love to hear from you today on Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on EWTN. Do stay with us. It's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Back to the phones now here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Here is Rael in Jacksonville, Florida, listening on the EWTN app. Hey there, Rael. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, thank you for taking my call. I just a little bit confused here reading Genesis chapter 1, describe how God, Elohim, called the cosmos into existence, while Genesis chapter 2, the name of God changes from Elohim to Yahweh. And can the doctor explain what that means? I'm a little bit confused.
Sure. So there is a theory. I'm going to stress it's a theory, and as a Catholic, you're not obligated to hold it, although most Catholic biblical scholars do hold it, that initially the book of Genesis was several different books or several different traditions that were woven together at a particular point in time. And conveniently, biblical scholars refer to the author of one account as the Yahwist, after the Hebrew word Yahweh, and the other as the Elohist, after the Hebrew word Elohim, and that they have, I should say, not conflicting, I'll call them complementary, but different theologies. And no less eminent a person than Pope St. John Paul II references these traditions in his theology of the body. So when he engages these texts, Pope John Paul II is perfectly comfortable talking about the Elohists' contributions and the Yahwists' contributions. And the important thing for us as Catholics, when we take the whole Bible, I mean, not just the book of Genesis, I mean, it's evident that the book of Genesis, whoever the authors of Genesis, are not the same people that wrote, say, St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Romans has somewhat different concerns than the book of Genesis. That's not a problem for me as a Catholic. I understand that my job as a Catholic is to receive the whole collection as divine inspiration and to be guided by the Church in the interpretation and the application of these texts to my life. So it's not a problem for there to be divergent viewpoints in sacred Scripture, provided they're integrated into a common vision enlightened by the teaching of the Church. And so we do the same thing with the book of Genesis, right? Okay. You can take individual texts of Genesis that may have different structure and maybe different authors and maybe slightly different messages. They can be integrated together, however, in a coherent narrative that runs throughout the book of Genesis, and that of course, narrative can be woven together with the larger narrative of salvation history that we find in the totality of the Bible.
Rael, is that helpful for you, sir?
Yes.
All right. Very good. Hey, thanks so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. A couple lines open. Not too late for you to call 833-288-EWTN if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 833-288-3986. Chris is in Southern California, and Chris is listening on the EWTN app as well. Hey, Chris, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hello. I'd like to ask Dr. Anders about the compilation of the Old Testament in terms of what we would have had before the approval by the Council of Trent or whatever, in terms of the Talmud, the Torah, and I heard there was 1,000 years between the Talmud and the Torah in terms of the wisdom literature and the prophets. So I just kind of trying to sort all that out.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the history of the Old Testament canon is somewhat shrouded in mystery, meaning that there's a lot of things that we don't know about the formation of the canon in its early stages. And prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the early 20th century, the oldest extant manuscripts, that is to say a physical copy of the Bible that we possessed, were from Jewish scribes in the Middle Ages called the Masoretes. So they're Masoretic texts that would have dated from the High Middle Ages. And so you're talking about the Hebrew texts here. You're talking about Hebrew texts that are more than 1,000 years removed from the date of the original composition. what made everybody so excited about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that we found biblical manuscripts that dated from before the time of Christ, and there were Old Testament texts, but there were texts of books that are not in our current Old Testament. There were Jewish apocalyptic texts and apocryphal texts from Second Temple Judaism that are no longer revered by anybody as sacred scripture. And they were all found together. And so scholars were able to compare texts of the Old Testament from, say, 2,000 years ago to the otherwise more recent Masoretic texts. And obviously they found many points of commonality. I mean, by and large, more commonality than otherwise. But they found points of differences as well. And one of the interesting things that they found at Qumran was that there would be multiple versions of the same book. So, for example, you would find copies of the Isaiah scroll. It's one of the Old Testament books that had the most extant copies, and they didn't all agree with one another.
Huh.
And sometimes they had differences of wording. Sometimes they had one had whole chapters left out. And one has the impression that there might not have been, not only was there not a fixed canon, but there may not have even been a fixed text. That the texts themselves were somewhat fluidly transmitted. Now, there was a Greek version of the Old Testament that entered into circulation for which there is a fairly constant tradition and a set of texts that we can identify called the Septuagint. And the Septuagint shows some differences when you translate that Greek back into Hebrew from the Hebrew text that we found at Qumran, but a lot of overlap and similarities as well. And the position of the early church, which was aware of the fact that there were Hebrew texts in circulation, was that when you needed a definitive text, that you defaulted to the Septuagint, to the Greek text. And the reason for that was twofold. One is that it was the text that it seemed the authors of the New Testament referred to. And so when you look at when the New Testament cites the Old Testament, about 95% of the time it cites the Septuagint. And then the Septuagint was the version that got circulated for canonical use in the liturgy. So as you traveled the ancient world and you went to Mass and you heard the scriptures read, they were read to you in the Septuagint. And so St. Augustine of Hippo, who's a 4th century Catholic theologian, doctor of the church, and bishop, raises the question explicitly in a little book called On Christian Doctrine. When Christians have to decide what version of the Old Testament to use, what should they use? And Augustine says they should use the Septuagint because it is the ecclesiastical version. Now, the Septuagint is actually pretty well preserved, and we have, say, for example, Origen, who is a second and third century church father, who wrote a collection called the Hexapla, I believe that's the title, where he had parallel translations of Greek and Hebrew and I believe Latin, and he had more than one version of each. And he does kind of a textual commentary looking at these different versions. And from Origen, we have a pretty good idea what the Septuagint text was, and we have other ancient manuscripts as well. But in terms of ecclesiastical use, the pattern of citing the Old Testament as an authority, you can infer from the church fathers what texts they used in the liturgy, what texts they used in their commentaries. There were some disagreements, between them, but by and large, their pattern of citations corresponds to what the Council of Trent would eventually define on the basis of sacred tradition. Whenever the church defines something, it does so because there's an antecedent tradition. And it's just saying, hey, that thing we've been doing all this time? Yeah, that's the right way to do it, right? And so the Council of Trent wasn't making something up when they defined the canon of the Old Testament. They basically solidified what had been the practical canon of Catholics for, at that point, 1,500 years. There's a great book that covers some of this material that you might get a hold of by Bishop Henry Graham called Where We Got the Bible, Our Debt to the Catholic Church.
Okay, well, there you go. Chris, is that helpful for you, sir?
Where We Got the Bible.
Where We Got the Bible. There you go. All right, thank you so much for your call. It is called to communion here on EWTN. Not too late for your phone call, but it's getting a little on the late side. 833-288-EWTN if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 833-288-3986. I think I know how you're going to answer this one. This is from Madeline, who says, Do female Anglican bishops have apostolic succession? And are their sacraments valid?
Yes, thank you. Well, more importantly, do male Anglican bishops have valid apostolic succession, and are their sacraments valid? And the answer to that question is no. No Anglican bishops no Anglican bishops who received their ordination from the Anglican Church have valid apostolic succession or sacraments. Now, you could conceivably, for the sake of argument, you could have a Catholic bishop who was validly ordained, who went into schism and left the church and went off and became an Anglican. He would have valid orders because he got them from the Catholic faith. But if he got them using the Anglican rite of ordination, from an Anglican who got them from the Anglican rite of ordination, then he wouldn't have valid orders. And this question was first adjudicated in the 16th century. Cardinal Pole looked into the ordinations that had been conducted during the reign of Henry VIII, who of course left the Catholic Church, and concluded that they were all valid. That the initial crop of Anglican bishops had valid orders. Okay. Right? And they could have kept them if they'd wanted them, but they didn't want them. And then what happened when Edward came to the throne? Of course, Edward was a child, and so he was more or less controlled and manipulated by his Calvinist preceptors and advisors. And they, as I already alluded, were heavily influenced by the Calvinist doctrine of the sacraments and of ordination. Mm-hmm. And so during the reign of King Edward, the Anglican Church changed its rite of ordination, the so-called Edwardine ordinal, and they so changed the meaning of the rite that it ceased to be a valid rite, and therefore it ceased to give valid orders and valid apostolic succession. Now, the question got raised again and that's been the practice of the Church ever since the Reformation. It was raised again in the 19th century because there were Anglican liturgists that were keen to argue for the apostolic origins of Anglicanism, and they promulgated the so-called branch theory of Western Christianity, that the Apostolic Church exists in three branches: Anglican, Catholic, and Orthodox. But for that theory to hold water, the Catholics and the Orthodox would have to agree to it, right? Yeah. And that's never been the case. The Catholics and Orthodox never regarded Anglican orders as valid. And so they tried to change the Pope's mind to recognize Anglican orders as valid. And so the question was raised again, and Pope Leo XIII looked into it, and he wrote an encyclical on the topic called Apostolicae Curiae, which, I might add, Cardinal Ratzinger, as the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, that's the Church's highest doctrinal office, has concluded that Apostolicae Curiae is infallible Church teaching. Just so if anybody tells you otherwise, that's the ruling of the CDF, is it is infallible teaching, that Anglican orders are absolutely null and void. Absolutely null and void. So it doesn't matter if you're male, if you're female, if you can't make up your mind, if you're an Anglican bishop and you received the Anglican rite of ordination, right, in that line of succession from the Edwardine ordinal, then you do not have valid orders. Now, again, the exception would be if an Anglican actually received his ordination in the Catholic Church and then left the Catholic Church. But if he turned around and used the Edwardine ordinal to ordain the next guy, that'd be the end of the line.
All right, Madeline, thanks so much for your email. Call to communion here on EWTN. We'll get back to the phones in just a second here. Let me tell you about one of our wonderful weekday programs that we have for you on EWTN Radio. That would be More to Life with Dr. Greg and Lisa Popcak at 10 a.m. Eastern each and every weekday on EWTN Radio. Dr. Greg and Lisa help listeners navigate the waters of family life with solutions straight from the genius of John Paul II's theology of the body. What a wonderful program it is. 10 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. It's More to Life with Dr. Greg and Lisa Popcak. All right, back to the phones now for Lisa in Pennsylvania, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hey, Lisa, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I have a question regarding when the Blessed Mother came to understand that Jesus was God or Son of God, equating. I understand she knew that he was the Messiah, but that's not necessarily the same as the Son of God. She didn't seem to know when Jesus was 12 in the temple, and didn't seem to understand why he needed to be in his father's home. But then Elizabeth, when Mary went to visit Elizabeth and help her, Elizabeth seemed to know that Mary was carrying the Son of God. So it's confusing.
Okay, Mary, did you know?
Yeah, right, exactly. So let's let's distinguish a couple of things. When you read sacred scripture, it's evident that the company of the disciples knew that Christ was an incredibly elevated person, and they rightly had the impulse to worship him, right? And that basic intuition that in confronting the person of Jesus on meeting God himself is characteristic of the earliest strata of Christian tradition. That is not to say the earliest strata of Christian tradition had worked out the complex doctrine of the Trinity in its Nicene definition. Right.
Okay. All right.
And that's the way doctrinal development works, is that there's a basic intuition that the church has, and that's essentially that's what saves us. But then subsequent generations of theologians can work out the fine details and articulate it in fine, precise scientific order. Now, I think we'd have to hold as an article of faith that Mary, in view of her dignity as the Mother of God, her immaculate conception, her exceeding holiness, and her elevated contemplation, would have had a profound intuition of the divine mission and identity of her Son. Did she have that all worked out in a fine, articulate theory that she could express verbally? I doubt it, right? And she was a human being with a limited intellect. But would she have known, at some level, perhaps even implicit, that her Son was in fact a profound divine visitation upon the human race? I think so. I can say that without feeling the need to get down in the nitty-gritty details of how explicitly could she have rendered that.
Lisa, thanks so much for your call from Pennsylvania. Here's an email from Gregory. Hi, my father-in-law is turning 90 soon. He is Catholic, although hasn't been active in many years. What advice do you have for us to discuss his interior spiritual disposition with him and steps that he or we can take to re-engage him with the faith and the promise of eternal life?
Yeah, thanks. So this is all presuming that you have a good relationship with him.
Sure.
Right? And this is a completely different picture if you don't, right? I remember when my dad, who I was extremely close to, when he was dying, I had a conversation with him, and I said one time, Dad, you might not be here very much longer. I mean, he had a terminal disease. We all knew it.
Yeah.
I said, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? And he said what he said. We did what we did.
Yeah.
And depending on what he says, you can always say, hey, if you would like for me to go get the priest or whatever, I can make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I also would caution you against making your last moments in the last days with your father a kind of high-pressure session in religious coercion, right? So you have to respect the dignity of his conscience, and I would also say trust in the love and mercy of God. But be open, be present, have conversations. But they should proceed out of a kind of not anxious, open-minded charity and love.
Yeah. And Gregory, thank you so much for your concern for your father-in-law. Call to communion here on EWTN. An email from Charlie now. Can we safely say that human culture has never had a problem believing in supernatural manifestations until the Enlightenment? And since pure reason took over, it has taken a toll on the faith of Christianity.
Thanks. I appreciate the question, although I disagree with it.
Okay.
Because, of course, the Old Testament, the Psalms, and the Psalter, the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and other Old Testament texts clearly evidence materialism and atheism as real viable options, as living concerns, existential concerns for the ancient world. When I study the history of ancient philosophy, whether I look at Greek and Roman philosophy or Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy, questions about the existence of the gods or God and the supernatural continually recur, and you find divergent points of view. I mean, you find rank materialists like Democritus, and the resultant Epicureanism of the end of life is pleasure, and where death is, I am not, and where I am, death is not. That was Epicurus's line, or Lucretius among the Romans and others. And you find skeptics in the Renaissance period and the early Reformation, Faustus Socinus or Servetus and others, So rationalism, atheism, atomism, materialism. These were all live options, and you find within Hinduism you find the same kind of permutation of schools of thought. Bleeding from polytheism to monism to outright materialism. So no, I don't think it's at all unique to the 18th century. I think a couple things characterize the Enlightenment. It's not atheism, and it's not the appeal to reason. One, of course, was that the scientific Reformation, which of course has Catholic provenance, threw up a model of human rationality, sort of the quantitative analytical thing, experimental science and so forth. That was an innovation, that there's a sort of new model of rationality that provided an alternative to the scholastic logic and Aristotelian philosophy that had dominated the universities. And it was so effective, scientific reasoning was so effective that it offered a kind of very powerful rebuke to what was seen to be the kind of the moribund nature of some scholastic thought. The other thing that really characterized the Enlightenment, I think, was something else that was a Christian impulse, and namely that was an awareness of the dignity of the human person and the human conscience and the value of freedom. And so the Enlightenment philosophers employed their idolization of science and the scientific method in the service of critiquing both church and state where they found them to be unjust. When they thought that there was kind of arbitrary, tyrannical imposition of power that frustrated human freedom or human dignity, they wielded that pen with powerful rhetorical effect. And so things like the defense of the idea of the rights of man, Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, these sorts of things were, Locke's treatise on human nature. These were influential in things like the American Revolution, of course, ultimately the French Revolution. Now, where the Enlightenment, I think, went overboard was in the rampant and eventually violent anti-clericalism to which the French Revolution gave expression, and the outright persecution of Catholics, and say like the war in Vendée, for example. So that we definitely went overboard. And there are things we can criticize about it, and there are the specific moves in Enlightenment philosophy. I think Catholics today would look back on the kind of Kantian idealism and the overemphasis on a highly skeptical metaphysic, the so-called critical move in philosophy that Kant initiated, as mistakes in philosophy. But I think it's a bad idea personally to take everything as all or nothing. There's nothing redeemable in any philosophical move. It's not like that. Intellectual development is messy. It's spotty. It's a dialogue of different voices in dialectic with one another. And while I have my preferences for philosophers, Catholic philosophy today can't simply just skip over the 18th century and go back to the Baroque period and act like nothing happened. There were legitimate critiques that were offered in the 18th century, which Catholics have to deal and take seriously. And so, we can. I read a great book one time on the Lenten exercise of reading atheist philosophers, right? Because it was basically the point of it was basically, when someone has a legitimate critique of the church, maybe it's you they're criticizing, right? There may be something about the way you're doing business that's provoking this. Take seriously the accusations that are made against you so that you can learn from them and answer them compellingly. My hero, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas, does this all the time. He doesn't just engage, say, Averroism and say Averroes was all wrong and a pox on his house. He dives into the work of non-Catholic philosophers and says, what is there that I can accept? What is there that I have to reject? How can I integrate their positive insights into my system in a way that makes what I do immune to their criticisms, right? So if there's an Enlightenment philosopher who says, hey, the church was abusive of human dignity in this place, the response isn't to say, let's cut off the heads of the Enlightenment philosophers. It's to say, well, maybe there's something to that. Maybe we should pay attention and not treat people badly in this area as they accused us of doing, and let's do better philosophy than they do, right? That's Leo XIII's response to the Enlightenment, was not just to run and stick his head in the sand, but to say, let's revivify Catholic philosophy so that we can give a compelling answer to the charges that have been made against us.
And we can certainly learn from everybody.
Absolutely.
Good, bad, and ugly.
As St. Thomas did.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Charlie, for your email. And that is going to close us out. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
We do this program Monday through Friday on EWTN Radio. Check us out live at 2 p.m. Eastern each and every weekday. You can also check out the podcast anytime you wish by going to EWTN.com. Click on the radio box. Then once you're there, that actually takes you to the radio homepage. Look for the words Podcast Central. You'll find about 100 podcasts from our partners all over the world, including those that we produce right here at EWTN. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to our next visit right here on Call to Communion on EWTN. Have a wonderful day and God bless.